everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm very proud and happy to introduce Kim Martinez to our artist lecture program. Kim has just a huge, really, it's been a success already. And Kim is quite established. She has an MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago. She is currently a professor at the University of Utah. Her current teaching projects include the Tanner Humanities Center, Professors Off-Campus Project Murals, and community-based research, landscape art on the Colorado River Plateau, Mill Creek Trailhead mural, Inside Out mural painting, and portable community mural residency. Kim has been honored by the university with many awards, including Celebrate You, a showcase of extraordinary faculty achievements, highlighting faculty who have reached a pinnacle of professional success and were selected to represent the top research within their college, and this was in 2015. University of Utah Vice President for Research in 2016, awarded by the University of Utah, recognizing faculty who invent things with potential to change the world and improve lives. The Distinguished Innovation and Impact Award in 2014. Kim has exhibited work internationally with drawings and paintings and murals and videos, and just a short list of her venues: Bosnia, Herzegovina, Brazil, Chile, China, Colombia, Guatemala, Hungary, Mexico, occupied Palestinian territory, and Peru. Please join me in welcoming Kim to our community.
Thank you, Barbara. So thank you all for coming. Can you hear me okay? Because I usually have a pretty big voice, and I'm a little nervous having this on. It might be bigger than you want it to be. Is it okay? Okay, we're good. All right, so one of the things I like to do when I start these kind of things is tell you a little bit about who I am. I'm a native of Utah. My mother is Scandinavian. My father is Mexican. And they are both very much interested in their own cultures. And so they're very strong in their religious base, too. So they made a decision that all of their sons would be raised LDS and all of their daughters would be raised Catholic. So as you can imagine, it was pretty interesting dialogue around the dinner table, that kind of thing. But for me, that kind of upbringing made me question a lot of different things. In that I was always questioning gender relationships, social relationships, the kind of things that, where I fit into the world. I kind of think of myself as a border person. In many ways, I don't really fit in one category or the other. And I consider myself more on I identify as Chicana more than I do my Scandinavian side of the family. So those kind of, that kind of, growing up made me the kind of artist I am today. So what I think of myself when I think about my art is I consider myself a political painter, an artist. And what I mean by political art is art that has a kind of a political context or opinion, right? So I'm not so much of a modernist in that, I make art for art's sake. Most of my work is about trying to understand things. The work that I'm going to be showing, that I'm showing over in the gallery, is really about our southern border, and simply because I wanted to understand what was going on down there. I did not cross the border. I have family and friends that have, and so to make this work, I did observational work, worked with family members, friends, to understand and try to pull all that stuff together to make the work. So the name of the show is 7 Steps Forward, 7 Steps Back. And I came up with that because I went down to the border and I spent 7 days down there. And so what the 7 steps forward and 7 steps back means, if you didn't read this statement, is that during certain indigenous cultures, when a person passes, they'll visit the grave for 7 days, they'll walk forward 7 steps and backward 7 steps when leaving, so they don't turn their back 4 times a day. And this is to ensure safe entry into the afterlife for these folks. So that's, because when I went to the desert, it's pretty harsh. Now, so I wanted to understand the sensitivity of what was going on down there. So I Before I went, I did a lot of research and looked at the different trails that people took to come into the country. I also connected with a group out of Tucson called the Humane Borders Project and volunteered with them for a few days. And what their project was is that they would go, they set up like water tanks throughout the desert, and they'd fill them with water so the migrants would have places to get fresh water. And then they'd put a big blue flag up so that you could see them from a distance. Now, this time, there was a lot of vigilante folks out there who wanted to, make it impossible for people to cross, so they would poison the water, so we'd have to check to make sure the pH balance is right. And, so working with those folks, I went to a lot of different ways. So there's drawings like this that you'll see in the video that are from my sketchbook. So there would be drawings in the dirt with arrows that would be for the coyotes to let the migrants know where the staging area is, where they could be picked up for later transport. The other thing is that, a lot of people ask me, why is this an animated video? And the reason is this is really difficult stuff to interact with, right? And so I needed to create a psychic distance for the work so that people would look at it and they'd think about it. Because it's really tough if you look at people in a lot of pain, right? I know I can't do it very well. So while I was doing this research, I was dealing with this stuff, and I thought I needed to do something so people would look at it. And so I chose this way of making the work so I could create that psychic distance to create interaction with folks. The narrative process for the video was very organic, meaning many times when people create videos, they'll create a storyboard, they'll know the beginning, the middle, and the end. Now, I didn't want to do that, because in many ways I wanted it to be just like my journey in that I didn't know what was going to happen. And if I didn't have that course set out in the beginning of making the images, it would act as a way to destabilize the viewer, which is what I wanted, what was happening for me when I was in the desert doing it. So the process was also part of the way that I hope the final image is read as you look at the video. So I went to the desert with a high school teacher, and we went and traveled various borders with Humane Borders and spent a few days there. Then we went to Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument because we wanted to go to the Highway of the Devil. Have you guys all heard of that? Basically it was from, it's been around for a long time. It was the Vasquez de Coronado's expedition who used that highway to find the 7 mythical cities of gold. So it's been used as a transportation hub for a very long time. So I wanted to take that route, but when we got there, the Border Patrol wouldn't let me in because somebody had been killed the day before. So it's a pretty rough area, so we weren't able to go there through that particular area. So as we were on the border, we saw a lot of military. So we live on a militarized border now, right? It's full, mostly on the American side is where I saw most of the high-powered weapons, more so than I saw on the Mexican side. So, and what was strange to me is I'm not really sure if there's, I think they're beginning to put sensors in the ground out there because there's areas where there isn't any fence at all. If there is a fence, it's like this. But I was out walking and all of a sudden there would be guys on their little motorcycle things within 15, 20 minutes. So I think there's more out there than we can see or even know about. So from there, we after we did the Humane Border stuff, I then went to Sansabe, Mexico, which is a main border port, another border port to get into the country and a place for a lot of staging. So I connected with the mayor of Sansabe, who connected me with an expatriate from California, actually. Her name is Christina, who drove me around and showed me a lot of the various staging areas where there are truckloads of people waiting to come in with the coyotes over the country. A lot of the Mexican bricks that we buy in this country are made in Sansabe. It's one of the largest forms of commerce that they have there. And then there we went to, we ended in Nogales, in the sister cities of Nogales. And this is in the days before when they had the old scrap metal fence with crosses on it that sits been replaced with a very intense fence now. This border fence was a lot more interesting because artists would paint it and decorate it with crosses and all kinds of things to show the people that had died. So, and obviously there's a lot of memorials along that fence. So that gives you an idea of how the work came into being. Because for me, I'm very romantic. I didn't want to just read about it. I needed to experience it to understand how I was going to make the work, right? So then I started the work. Well, it still always started the work, but so I started this piece right here before I even left, right? Because I was trying to map out the pieces. So I call this random process. And basically, it's a process that I know I kind of have an idea of what's going to happen, but it's a mind map. So I would go, okay, I'm going to go here and here and here. And so throughout this, it just gives me a way to understand what my research is. If I was an anthropologist, I'd probably have a notebook and I'd take notes and I'd write it in the notebook. But because I'm a visual artist, I'm going to write everything right here so that when I'm in the studio, I can go to that place and go, okay, this is where I need to focus right now, right? Because it's such a big issue. It can be easy to make one painting and want to say everything at once. So that's how I, kind of work in my process within the piece. This piece is called Here Be Dragons, and this was my first character development. Here I'm starting to, and this is really the first painting, because I needed to make some characters for this video. I didn't know what it was going to be yet, right? But I think by painting. So I just started to paint this. This is on oil paint on linen. So I made this, and I was thinking about, from that mind mapping, I was thinking about colonization. I was thinking about all the stuff that I'd seen in the deserts, the snakes, the different sensors and things like that. And at the same time, when I'm down there, there's a lot of issues with the vigilantes that are happening down there. So I wanted to bring these characters into it. So I made this painting to figure out how the character development would work. So, and from this, it was an oil painting. I realized that there were things that were working, other things that weren't working conceptually and formally for me. So the next piece, this Biopower, became more in line with what I wanted it to look like. And let me go back a little bit. So the paintings I'm showing you now are kind of after I made the video in some ways, because I wanted to I put the video together, and these scenes came, I didn't make the scenes, but I wanted to talk about it. So with these, I wanted to talk about the surveillance that went on the border, which, is, since this has happened, I think the ACLU makes it illegal for drones to go on the Mexican side of the border, but it's okay for them to be on the American side of the border. So your rights are also being jeopardized too. So, and one of the things they're doing with the surveillance stuff is they're making different kind of insects, kind of really small ones, but the Mexicans called them mosquitoes because there were so many drones in their airspace initially when the drones were first starting to come out. And by calling this Biopower, I'm kind of thinking about Foucault's idea of the, Biopower is kind of a philosophy that talks about if governments can regulate birth and death and all these different things, so a way to regulate our biology in many ways, right? So one of the things is that this was kind of thinking about the detention centers that we have. So I made the other thing out in the desert is you have a lot of dust devils, right? So I wanted to make the dust devils and also talk about the detention centers that we do in this country with folks that we pick up that make the border crossing. In Utah, for instance, we have 7 of them in 2 of our counties. Texas has 12, and Arizona has 5, and we spend about $6 billion a year on these facilities, right? So, and that's probably low. I don't know what it'll be next year with the new budgets that are coming in. So this is Existential Space. A lot of people said, why the mayonnaise? Right? That doesn't make sense. But what happened is when I was working with Humane Borders and we were going around and we were cleaning up those campsites, because there's billions of pounds of garbage that the migrants leave behind because they have to drop it, right? Because it's hot. And as I was cleaning it up, I kept seeing lots and lots of empty containers of mayonnaise and mayonnaise packages. And I thought, wow, that's just ingenious. It's high calorie, high protein, lightweight food product to come in. And then I put it with the kind of the coyote look, because one of the things that I found out was that the coyotes today are more of the cartel, work for the cartel. Probably 20 years ago, they were more of a mom and pop organization to help the migrants get across. So oftentimes what they'll do is they'll take things away from them, like their food or their water or whatever they need to do to control them within that space. So that's why it's kind of so that's my symbol for the coyote figure within the whole process. And this is Fast and Furious in Nogales. During about 2008? No, 6 through 11. The ATF allowed 2,500 guns to be sold to the Mexican cartels, right? And that they thought it was a sting operation. So and it's really illegal. Mexico, you're not even supposed to have guns, right? So the American government sold all these firearms to the cartels who were killing everyone around them, right? And they were doing it in secret because they thought, well, let's sell it to them and then we can catch them in the act and arrest them. Well, that didn't work so well, right? The only reason it even came to light is that an American Border Patrol agent was killed with one of the guns and they found out the problems. And so far, only about 600 of them have been found. So all those guns are out there in Mexico. This painting, so Nogales is also really famous for underground tunnels. And, you know, when I was there, it's like you wonder, did I dream this or I see this, or was I like, you know, because I'd been in the desert for so long. But, you know, people, I thought I could see like heads popping up on the street. And I went, what is this? But, you know, there are a lot of underground tunnels in Nogales, in that there's a lot of smuggling that goes on there, even today. So, so this painting was kind of about that, what am I seeing, thinking kind of stuff. So this is a fairly newer piece. This is a black velvet etched, laser etched piece that talks about, you know, that gives, you know, so this is a map of this area right here that talks about, because there's so many unidentified folks that have been killed over with the cartels, and even probably still today, even though the cartels aren't as strong as they used to be. But the reason I use the velvet is that going back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, black velvet was a form of art making that put a lot of young people to work in the border towns of Mexico. You know, so there was a guy named Chuy Moran who was the king of velvet or something, right? So before NAFTA came in, it was one of the ways that a lot of Mexican youth were able to make money. So I thought it was fitting that I would use that material for this particular sort of moribund signage, you know, kind of talking about the text of what's going on there. And certainly there's probably a lot more people in the desert than we know about. That's just the ones we've been able to identify. Now off to the video. One of the things about the video, like I said, it kind of came organically. I didn't know what it was going to do. And then it came time to name the scenes of the video, right? So, because while the scenes are basically artifacts of the video, I also think of them as standalone kind of works too, right? So I wanted to give them different titles that meant something, and I wanted them to be kind of allegorical in a certain way. So I went back to The Daughters of Albion by William Blake in 1794. Are you guys familiar with that poem? Yeah? No? Well, basically in a nutshell, this is how it goes. So this is written in 1694. He was an Englishman, right? And so he was writing this poem about the promise of America. You know, that in America there would be equality, women would have rights, you know, there would be, you know, all men would be created and women would be created equal, that it was a pure landscape. Well, it turns out that in practice that's not at all how America turned out to be, even after the British had won their independence from Britain, right? So the colonization. So he writes this poem about the Daughters of Albion. And so there's three main figures. There's Othune, who is a half black and probably the product of a rape between a slave owner, right, and a slave. And there's Bromium, who is kind of an aggressive guy. I kind of think of him as an extreme right kind of character. And then I can never say his name, Theo Tormund, who is really quite left and very, very passive. And so basically throughout the poem, what happens is that she's raped, and they equate her to kind of thinking of her as like like landscape. You know, we've often talked about raping the landscape, and we talk about Mother Earth, so she becomes a symbol for that. And then, you know, the other, you know, the kind of aggression that comes through with wanting to conquer everything, and the other one that just lets it happen because they're sort of stuck in this sort of spiritual place that, you know, you can't touch me kind of thing because I'm not of this world, right? So we can kind of equate that in different sorts of ways of thinking about the poem that I think is kind of interesting. So we start out with this image here that's of a train station in Arizona that has been abandoned. So I also was thinking of the Barcerio program within this. So in the short hoe program, my dad was a migrant farm worker, and so they tell tales about the short hoe and cutting down different crops and things like that, and how difficult that kind of lifestyle was. So you have the guy that's here in America, you know, with the short hoe, saying that there's work to come. You have all the people that come in, but they don't have everything they need. They're, you know, moving quickly, trying to get to the border. And then they get to the kind of cutoff line, and there's all of these sort of surveillance monsters that come into them. And then, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, there was the whole idea of the sensors in the ground that I was constantly coming into. So these just became ways to talk about the sensors that were underfoot, not really knowing. So this is St. Anthony. One of the things that, you know, St. Anthony's is patron saint of lost things. A lot of folks that I know pray to St. Anthony when their loved ones are missing. And so in this particular case, St. Anthony's being tortured because the loved, you know, it's kind of a thing within the culture to turn him upside down until the loved one comes home. And, you know, sometimes they never come home. And so the candles just become representative of all the different folks that don't come home. And then in the video you saw it continue to move. In this particular piece, what I was thinking a lot about was families, in that before the tightening of the borders in the early aughts, late 90s, it wasn't uncommon for men just to make the crossing a couple times a year. They would just come over here, work for seasonally, send money back home, and then go home for 3 months and do this over and over again. But then what happened is the border became tighter, so whole families would have to come over because the usually males, sometimes there were women, would not be able to make the trip back and forth quite as easily as they had at that point. Because remember, this has been going on for thousands of years, right? So then I started thinking about how much money these fences are costing us, right? So this, you know, because it could certainly be better used for educating us and doing all kinds of things that, you know, would make our lives a better place. So I think about, like, between 2006 and 2009, Border Patrol spent $2.4 billion to complete 670 miles of fence. That's a whole lot of money, right? And that we're paying for. And so this kind of idea came into thinking about that. And what's going to happen now is that not only does it cost us a lot of money, but the government can do this thing called eminent domain. So if you guys live along the border, right? So the government can come in and say, oh, we need your land for the fence we're going to build. So you don't have a choice. You kind of have to give it to them, right? So unless we can make some changes, you know, it affects even, you know, especially folks here, right? Me in Utah, not so much, right? But you guys you're really on the front lines. Okay, so remember going back to the infinite, so here I'm thinking about that infinite telescope, right? So I'm coming back to making these characters, right? Going back to this kind of vigilante Minuteman character. So I started thinking about, you know, somebody like John Locke, who talks about the infinite microscope back in the 1670s or something like that, right? And he says, if you like look at something with telescopes, if you make it 10 times bigger than what you're seeing, it's going to be a whole different world. Just think, if you had to see a spider at 10 times the magnification, how scary that would be, right? So I kind of think, with these characters, I had them have these sort of microscopic lenses on their faces so that you could say that they have so much fear, right? Because in some ways, they choose to wear these things, or are they stuck on their faces? I don't know, you know, I mean, I'm really interested in this idea of victim and victimizer, you know, because I don't think all victims are always victims and all victimizers are always victimizers, right? So it's kind of trying to find that place. So within this character, that's having these, looking at this microscopic world, and then he's got his colonial, neck piece on, talks about that, and he's not seeing what's going on right behind his back, right? Because of fear. Here, the coyote in legend and things is always kind of thought of as the trickster, so in this particular piece I was starting to think a lot about something my dad told me about when they wanted to kill a turkey. What they would do on the farm is they would draw a line on the ground, and the turkey would become so enamored with it that you could then do anything you wanted to the turkey and he wouldn't even notice because he was staring at that line in the ground, right? So in this piece, the trickster is, kind of put this line in the ground, and he doesn't notice that there's this sort of monster there that's going to eat him, right? Because he's too preoccupied by not looking up and around, right? So, so then from this scene, then he goes into the hypnosis scene where you hear the, which is basically saran wrap I'm pulling out. And so then he comes in here, so he's being eaten by this sort of monster thing and comes out as this vigilante kind of figure that is kind of begins to terrorize. This next one, this came out of a idea of thinking of, there was an article in the paper how they were using trebuchets to throw marijuana and drugs over the border. So it became a way to talk about how not only are they throwing drugs and things, they're throwing people over the border, and it doesn't really matter what happens as long as they get their cuts. So that's how that came, that's what that piece talks about. And then one of the big things, and it's starting to change. As a matter of fact, there's lots of different conversations of why it's changing. But the women of Juarez, you guys are all familiar with that, right? How many women were there? The Macador murders, about between 420 to 500 women were killed in 15 years. Oftentimes their bodies were mutilated and killed, and there were all kinds of stories going around that they were being killed and raped by the cartel or by a masochist or for organ harvesting. Now a lot of people were like, that I talked to said, oh, it's all about organ harvesting. I couldn't find a thing about that anywhere. I think that's a myth. I don't know what the murders have stopped at this point, so it could be, or at least they're not as noticeable. And there's lots of different reasons. There's lots of violence to women within the border towns, and especially for migrants that are crossing. I think the numbers are about 8 out of 10 women that make the border crossing are somehow going to be raped or have some sort of physical injury to them. So it's problematic. One of the Amnesty International says 6 out of 10. Excuse me, I had that a little bit high. Say that that will happen within the women. So I was thinking about this and trying to find that information, and it never came. And so I thought, well, I can still think about the removal of the heart as pulling the heart out of the country, because I think that's really what's happening here, is it becomes a metaphor for what, in my opinion, is happening to people in our two countries, not just in one, but in both, for me anyway. The Arizona Recovered Human Project estimates the remains of more than 6,000 men, women, and children have been recovered since the 1990s. So that's a lot of people that we're losing over a line in the ground, right? That I hope that as one of the reasons I made this piece is so that we can all collectively start to think about different ways of dealing with this conversation, and hopefully the people that are sitting in this room will be able to do something there too. So here we have these kind of, somebody said they look like the Republican elephant, and I went, yeah, kind of, huh? But I didn't have that intention at all. I was just thinking about big ears and, kind of ways of smelling and things like that. That's just one of those things that happens sometimes when you're making work. And so here, I have the bird, and I chose not to make it an eagle, more of a hawk, because I didn't want to be so political that it's all of America's fault, because I don't think so. I think it's, there's a lot of different things for it. I think we can do some changes, but, it becomes, just taking the heart and flying with it and seeing, figuring out a way to what we can do with that. So that's it.